Let's look at a few other things in Camera Raw. I find that a lot of people who are used to shooting JPEG images, they switch over to shooting RAW because somebody talks them into it. I'm not trying to talk you into it, I'm just telling you why I do. And then if you happen to like those reasons, then go for it, but otherwise shoot whatever you're comfortable with. But when some people that are used to shooting JPEG switch to RAW, they find their images look somewhat duller when they first open them. That's because JPEG images are processed in your camera. And there's settings in your camera for contrast, saturation, sharpness. They're only applied to JPEG files. They're processed in the camera. When you open it in Camera Raw, it hasn't been processed. All the sliders in here are usually set to 0, and it looks somewhat dull compared to what a JPEG would, because a JPEG's processed, this hasn't been. Well, if you want your images to look closer to what a JPEG would, because you're just switching over, here's how you can do that. You know how we have all these tabs? Well, if you click on the tabs, one of them is supposed to look like a little camera right there, and that's the tab called Camera Calibration. When you go in there, if you have a RAW file, you're going to find a pop-up menu in here called Camera Profile. And if you click on it, you're going to find a bunch of settings. And the topmost setting is the default. That's the Adobe standard. That's the way it would usually open. And so we can choose that. But these other ones are going to change based on what brand of camera you have, because these are trying to simulate the look of a JPEG image. And in your camera, oftentimes you have presets you can choose for the JPEG processing. Things on a Canon called faithful, landscape, neutral, and so on. And by choosing these, it's going to shift the colors in your image to look more like a JPEG file would render this. So we can come in here and switch between these, and you'll see the colors look different on each one. And you could see if there's one in particular that you seem to prefer on a regular basis, and then you could use that one from then on. I always find in a Canon's case that landscape looks ridiculous. If you've ever moved any of the sliders already, it makes the colors crazy. So anyway, you can do that with this particular pop-up menu, but it's in one of those areas where most people stay away from this because it looks scary. It's like channels in Photoshop. That people just like, no, I don't do channels. Well, most people don't do camera calibration in Photoshop. But that one little pop-up menu is pretty easy to use. You just click on it, switch between them, and you see your image change. So I just wanted to make sure that I'd mentioned it. Now, if you find that you really like one of these settings and you want to use it for every image from now on, then make sure that you do the next, well, let me back up. Let me show you how to save that as your default setting. Before you save it as your default setting, make sure that the image you're working on has not been adjusted, because any settings that have been applied to this picture are going to be saved as the defaults in a moment. And so we need to make sure we don't have like the saturation or some other thing cranked up for this particular image, because it's going to be now applied to every image I open from now on. So you got to be careful. So the first thing I would do is go near the upper right, and right here is an icon that's, you see a little triangle next to an icon. That means there's something hidden there. Remember, if you click and hold on anything that has a tiny triangle, it means that something will pop up. Well, that's a menu. And I want to first choose Camera Raw defaults. And all that means is get this image to its default settings, as if I have not moved any of the sliders at all. Then change only the setting that you want to change in your default settings. So choose whatever it is here that you liked. Go back to that side menu, and there's a choice called Save New Camera Raw Defaults. And that means save the settings that are currently applied to this image and make them the defaults. So therefore, now it would always use Camera Faithful as my default setting. Now there are some things that would be useful to do that with. One of them is, do you remember when we were in the Lens Corrections tab? There was a checkbox in here called Remove Chromatic Aberration. And what that did is it got rid of these tiny little halos of color around the edges of objects. And those halos are never anything that are enjoyable. You're always cursing about it, and sometimes you forget how it is you fix it. Well, if you just turn on that checkbox, and then you go to the side menu and say, save new camera raw defaults, now it's going to be on for every image you open. Or if you find that, let's say under sharpening, you don't always want your masking at 0. You find that you need it to be up a little bit in order to get it to prevent it from sharpening all your skies, your straight blue skies. So you bring it up a little, and then you go to the side menu and you say, save new camera raw defaults. And now all of the settings that are on this particular photograph are now the defaults. Just make sure before you do that, on whatever image it is you opened, you first chose defaults so you're starting from the defaults. Because who knows, if you open a random picture, if it's been adjusted in the past before, we don't want to just randomly get weird settings in there. Now you might freak out though that you're kind of messing with the defaults. What if you screw it up? Well, don't worry about it. If you go to the side menu, there's also a choice down here that's called Reset Camera Raw Defaults. That means reset it back to the factory defaults, you know, the ones that came with Photoshop. And therefore, you can experiment with this, and you find that you messed up on it. All you got to do is choose that, and you're back to the beginning, how you were. Okay? Then, in Camera Raw, one thing that we didn't have time to get into before, but I use all the time, and I would rather not have to use Photoshop to always do, because I like to finish a huge number of my images right in Camera Raw without ever opening them in Photoshop, is I find that oftentimes I need to fine-tune the colors in a picture. And in this image, you can see some rather distinct colors, greens, reds, oranges, and all that. But it doesn't always look that great when I'm just done with the basic sliders that are there. So if you look here, we have all these different tabs. If you ever want to know what one of the tabs is supposed to mean, usually you can hover over an icon and pause, and it will give you a tooltip. But we're going to go to HSL/grayscale. HSL stands for Hue, Saturation, and Luminance. HSL. Okay? And remember, luminance is just a fancy word for brightness. So hue, saturation, and brightness is what it means. So in here, I can come in now and dial in the saturation, or how colorful, that's what saturation means, is how colorful something is, all these different colors are. And so I can come in here, and to me, the reds in this image look almost artificially red. They're so colorful. Some people would like that, but I find that my eye is drawn to this red, and it's actually thinking about why is this so red instead of just enjoying the image. That's just me though. And so I can come over here and take the reds, and I have a slider where I can mellow them out, or I can make them really colorful. And if you ever look at a histogram and you see a really tall colored spike on the end, it means that you might have your colors so colorful that you're losing detail in those areas. And that really tall colored spike on the end is an indication of what's known as possible saturation clipping, which means you push something so colorful that the detail started going away because you went beyond 100% of what it was capable of, and you're asking for more. And when that happens, the only way it can make it look more colorful is to throw the detail away. And that might be happening to the tongue. If so, I'm going to take the reds, bring the saturation down. And as I do, I don't know if you notice or not, a little bit more detail comes into like the nose of the dragon that's there. And if you look at the histogram that's there, watch that spike on the end of the histogram as I bring the reds down. Do you see the spike getting shorter and shorter? That means less and smaller area is losing detail. Now no one else is going to see your histogram, so don't adjust your image until the histogram looks good. I never do that. The histogram is like your speedometer in your car. You glance at it quick to see if it's useful. It's not something you stare at when you're driving. If you do, you're not going to be a good driver. And if you stare at a histogram and that's what you try to get to look perfect, and some people talk about doing that, it's like print your histogram 6 feet in size and then print your image as a reference in the corner. The histogram is just a useful little thing. It doesn't matter if there's a spike on the end, it matters just what your picture looks like. Okay? So I'm going to bring down my reds because I think they're just a little bit too much. I can fine tune other colors. Maybe in here I want one of the other colors to become more prominent or less prominent. Maybe the yellows are a little too much because I want the other colors to stand out. So I could dial that down a little bit. Then I can go to the Hue tab. Hue means basic color. And I can shift the basic color of any one of these choices that are here. That means I can shift the reds, so now they're going more orange. Or if I go the other way, they're getting it, I don't know what you call that color, more pinkish, I guess. And so I can shift them around to fine tune it. And oftentimes I need to do that with greens and yellows. Green trees and bushes and things. Sometimes I just don't like the look of the color that's there. And so here I can take the greens and I can slide it around, make it more of a pure green, make it more of a yellowish green, whatever I want, and just dial it in. Adjust my yellows. Just get that right where I like it. So hue means basic color, saturation means how colorful, and then luminance is how bright or dark. And so if I want the tongue to be darker, the tongue is reddish, so I grab the red slider and I can move it up or down. And the combination of those three kinds of adjustments, hue, saturation, and luminance, makes it so you can make all sorts of adjustments. You can do the luminance on blues and your blue skies will get darker, but try not to do it to too large of an extent, because oftentimes the transition between the blue sky that you massively darkened and the trees that are touching the blue sky suddenly won't look appropriate because the blue sky wasn't anywhere near that dark, and you're suddenly making it dark, but you're not doing anything to the trees to get them to blend into that dark sky now. So be a little careful with this when you're adjusting them. Also with this, there's something nice, and that is up at the top left, we have our tools, and one of those tools is this guy, which if you look at it, what the heck is that icon? Doesn't that look weird? It's like, okay, it's a cross, a circle, and a triangle. Well, hover over it. If you ever don't know what something means, just hover over the icon. That's called the Targeted Adjustment tool. Let's click on it, and let's see what it's going to do for us here. Well, watch what happens if I click on the tongue, and then I drag left or right. Look at the sliders on the right side of my screen, the ones I were playing with before. Do you see them moving? What it's doing is it's figuring out what color that is. And since the tongue on this dragon is not perfectly red, it's a little bit orange. And so it moves the red slider and it moves the orange slider a little bit because it's just a hint of orange in there. And so then I could switch over here to saturation, and I can say, now I'm going to make that more or less colorful. And again, it's moving two sliders, but it's not moving them in equal amount because the tongue might be mainly red with a hint of orange mixed in, and so it figures that out more. And I can do the same thing, of course, with hue. So if I want to change the hue of whatever this background is, maybe I don't know if that's considered to be yellow or orange or what. Well, just grab that targeted adjustment tool up there, click on the area you're thinking of, and move it back and forth. It will grab the appropriate slider for you. Okay? Now, if you look at that particular icon, you see a triangle next to it. Remember, anytime you see a little triangle, it means there's more to that if you click and hold on it. And so there are right here where you can switch between, the equivalent to switching between those tabs on the right, you could switch between them right here. And this also works with this thing called grayscale mix, which is when you convert your image to grayscale, this thing works. Or if you learn how to use curves in Camera Raw, this thing can be used for it. But just so you're aware of that. Click Done. And so oftentimes I fine-tune the colors in my image with those sliders. It's very common to come in and see something like this. That's what it happened to be adjusted with this particular one. Here's what it looked like without the sliders. Here's what it looked like with. You see the colors of the shoes. And I didn't want the wall to compete with the tree and the shoes, so that you see that mellowed out the wall. But it's not unusual for me to do that. And if you use that targeted adjustment tool up at the top, you can do it pretty quickly, because you just end up clicking on your picture, dragging left or right on various colors. Now let's see how we can use that same HSL tab to convert something to black and white. In fact, let me make sure I have these all at defaults first. Okay. There's a checkbox simply at the top called Convert to Grayscale. And if I turn it on, it's going to pull all the color out. And it also moves these sliders for you, and it's simply trying to make the various colors that would be in your image look different than each other. If these were all centered, blues and greens and yellows, they would look very similar instead of being different in brightness. But now what we can do is go back up to that same tool we used before and just move our mouse on top of the image, click, and now it's going to brighten or darken everything in the picture that was the color that this area used to be. And if I need to see what color that area used to be, I could turn off the Convert to Grayscale checkbox, or I can click on this little icon in the lower right of Camera Raw to see without this and with. And then I could do things like brighten this one. But it's not isolating a building, it's trying to isolate a color. And so it's not going to be just that one building that changes. If there's anything else with a hint of that color in it, it's going to shift as well. I don't know if there's a blue building in there. We'll find out because there'd be some blue in the sky. So we can do that. Okay? So that's the other time it's useful. Question?
So the raw data file's keeping the black and white data as well?
Yeah, anytime you do anything in Camera Raw, it's just saved as text attached to your picture. And so this is not permanent at all when I click done. Anything you ever do to a raw file, never permanent, because all it is saving it as text attached to the picture. And all you'd have to do is open up the picture, go to the side menu over here and choose Camera Raw Defaults, and you would see the image as if you'd never processed it before in your lifetime. So you never have to worry about hitting that. That's why this says done instead of save. You're just saying, I'm done adjusting it for now, but it didn't actually change the raw file, it changed some text that's in there. One other thing that can be related to black and white, but doesn't have to be, so we'll look at it first with a color picture and then we'll move on to using it on a black and white, is that another one of the tabs that is found here is this guy. And if you hover over it, you'll see it's called split toning. Remember, if you double click on a slider, you'll reset it to its defaults, because right now this is not at default settings. I'm going to double click on these just to get them where they're all zeroed out. What split toning is split toning allows you to shift the color of the bright area of your picture or the dark area of your picture, or both, bright, dark, or both. So oftentimes when it comes to landscape images, you'll find that the areas that are in the shade look bluer than the areas that are being lit by the sun. Because if you think about what color sunlight is, it's somewhat warm, but the shaded areas are being lit by the blue sky that would be up there if it's a not overcast day. But if there's a blue sky, it's the light coming from the blue sky that's lighting the shadows, making them feel more blue than where the sunlight can directly hit. At least that's the way I think about it. I don't know absolutely for sure if that's how it is, but that's the way I think about it. And so we could, if we had an image where we noticed the shadowy areas looking too blue, we could try to force a different color in there into the dark portion of the image. Every color has an opposite, and if you can figure out what the opposite color is, you could absorb some of the blue. The opposite of blue happens to be yellow. So, but there's also some times when I just want to push a color into the bright or the dark portion of my picture.